And here we are saying hello to 2020 and all that that year was, and all of the losses that it brought in such surprising and almost immediate ways. Some very small, not getting to go to your child's volleyball game, and not getting to go on a vacation you wanted, and some much larger, of course, losing a job, losing a home, losing a loved one, of course, the largest grief of all. So in this time together, for about 40 minutes, what we'll do is we're going to explore some poems that help us to meet some of these griefs and help us to name some of these griefs. And then as we continue to meet them through poetry, I will be giving you lots of prompts to do writing on your own. So I'll read the poems and talk about them and offer you writing. So you may want to have a pen in your hand just to write down ideas, just to spark them for you. This video will totally be available again later, so you can watch it again and put it on pause and just use it like your own private workshop in your house. You can find the poem and read along, and then put me on pause and do your own writing later. So we won't be pausing for writing at this point, but giving you lots of ideas for future writing. And not only about the losses, but about the small blessings and even large blessings that may have come along with it too. And why do this? Why is it important? Like, we're through 2020, we're certainly not through the pandemic, but we're learning now how to live with a lot of this stuff. Why write about it now? I tell you what, I think I was reading this quote in The Atlantic this week. It was an article by Chloe Sheffa, and she said, "How we process and craft our stories also determines our resilience and our well-being. How we tell our stories can transform how we move through hard times." I think it's very important for us to pay attention to what just happened and notice the effect that it had on us, notice the effect that it had on the world. And when we begin to engage with our own narrative in this way, we actually change how our lives are. And I want to notice too that it can be very difficult when we're suffering and when those around us are suffering to find courage and keep moving forward. And poetry is one of the tools we have to help us do that, that keeps us from falling into despair, that keeps us from falling into nihilism, that helps us continue to wake up and pay attention. So let's read some poems together, friends, and we'll write poems too on our own later. I'll give you lots of ideas. So we're going to start with a poem by Octavio Paz. He was a Mexican, he lived in Mexico, a Mexican poet who was also a diplomat. And this poem is called After. It's certainly not a poem that was written for a pandemic, although obviously written for a very difficult time, and gives us a good idea about how we might catalog these small losses and see how they may transform. After, by Octavio Paz. And this translation is by Elliot Weinberger. After chopping off all the arms that reached out to me, after boarding up all the windows and doors, after filling all the pits with poisoned water, after building my house on a rock of no, inaccessible to flattery and fear, after cutting off my tongue and eating it, after hurling handfuls of silence and monosyllable of scorn at my loves, after forgetting my name and the name of my birthplace and the name of my race, and judging and sentencing myself to perpetual waiting and perpetual loneliness, I heard, against the stones of my dungeon of syllogisms, the humid, tender, insistent onset of spring. I think this poem is amazing in that it's a list poem, right? It's a list poem, one of the easiest kinds of poems to write, in that we just make a list of all of the things that came before now. What are all of these difficulties that we have gone through? And actually, I'm going to invite you to right now, go ahead and put some things into the chat box, put some of the examples of things that we've gone through. And you could even put the word after right in front of it. And we'll create a small poem right now together with it. After, and by the way, these losses can be of any size. Know that all of them matter. So it could be a loss like my daughter didn't get to go trick-or-treating and spent 10 hours on her costume, or after not getting to go to do this work trip that I really wanted to do, after my grandmother died. Any of these are possible. So go ahead and just write into the chat bar after, and these are things that were difficult about the pandemic, things that were losses. And then we'll come to the things that we're coming back to after that. So Bob Pelican actually put in after hugging my granddaughter. So for instance, we would say, after not hugging my granddaughter, after giving up playing music at the cafe, after the death of an adult son, after all the canceled celebrations, after my dad died, after worrying about the danger of every surface, after finding the courage to leave an unhealthy relationship, after the pandemic expanded, after losing my face to a mask, after missing the birth of my grandson, after not being able to, oh, I lost that one. After retiring unexpectedly, after not being able to see other people's expressions, after losing 6 members of our family, after being afraid of everyone, after losing on-site retreats, after not being able to go help my mom. Oh, that's quite a list, friends. And now, if you would, put a line in the chat bar that is where you are now. What is something about this moment that, and not looking forward, but about this very moment? Where are you right now? Where have all of these losses brought you? After not being able to hug anyone in person, after not going to French class in person, where are you now? Adjusting, enjoying a slower pace, reorienting, watching the milkweed emerge in the morning, waking grateful to be healthy, broken-hearted, still waiting to mourn with friends and family and community and public. After forgetting my poetic voice, I am now a flood of poems, enjoying the present moment, cursing the elm seeds that pile up in front of my door, trying to lose weight, seeing my vulnerable daughter again, practicing tenderness toward myself, finding my voice, loving French conversation on Zoom in my pajamas, and moving deeper into myself, that stranger coming forth. Wow, that was gorgeous. I got goosebumps, friends. That was really marvelous. Well, there it is. That's how we write a poem. It can be that simple, can't it? Of making a list of what happened before and finding the transformation that brings us to where we are now. That's one simple way to write a poem. Thank you, Octavio Paz, for that gorgeous way to meet a moment. And thank all of you for jumping in. That was really beautiful. Thanks for bringing your voices into this strange and amazing Zoom space that is one of the silver linings of this time. This is a poem by Tess Taylor. It's called There Doesn't Need to Be a Poem, and it's from the new anthology by James Cruz, How to Love the World. Tess Taylor is a poetry reviewer for NPR's All Things Considered. And I think that this poem is helpful for me because she's meeting a grief without naming it, without totally touching it, because sometimes we're not ready yet to meet a grief. And if that is the case for you, if there is a grief from 2020 so large that you still can't touch it, then I feel like this poem is an example of how you can still, as Emily Dickinson would say, make a circumference around it. You can still move around it without having to go to the most painful center of things. There doesn't need to be a poem. There doesn't need to be a poem for this sadness. Simply to breathe next to a stream that slips into the gutter near your house would be enough. To see next door in the graveyard the brown and yellow millipede bury itself below one granite stone, joining in the work of making soil. Just as now the faithful oxygen still turns the copper headstone green, oxidizing to patina despite all. By luck, your own feathered alveoli still red in blood, your fine cell walls trade oxygen for carbon and sift the windy mix we call the air. This happens, going on invisibly, even if no one remembers how, and even if it seems that pain is a volatile molecule, grief bonding unpredictably to things. Now, the late sun rims a cloud. You who watch that cloud, inhale, exhale. There doesn't need to be a poem by Tess Taylor. This poem, I think, is remarkable in that it offers us a way to meet a grief without totally touching it. And in a way, what she does in this poem is she allows us to be held by the world around us. I think it's interesting that the person in the poem, the person experiencing the grief, is the only thing not moving. Everything else is moving. The water in the gutter, the millipede making the soil, inside of us, the alveoli that are reddening the blood, trading the carbon dioxide for air, for oxygen. So it's amazing to me how even so the person in the poem is very still and not moving yet through the grief. It's too soon. Everything around them is moving. Everything inside them is moving. And all they have to do to meet this moment is breathe in and breathe out. If you are experiencing a grief right now that is too big to touch, that is too sensitive to meet with a poem yet, then instead of trying to write the poem of what is happening emotionally, write the poem of everything around you that is holding you. And you might choose to do, as Tess Taylor did, choose all the things that are moving, all the things that are systemic, all the things that are processes that are still going on. Notice them. And allow yourself to be still in the middle and held by all of that. I think that naming a grief is a difficult thing to do. We don't always know exactly how to do it. Grief comes to us kind of like a cloud and just holds us in that cloud, and we get foggier and foggier, and it's harder and harder to know exactly what's happening. And I love in this next poem how the grief is very clearly named. This is a very short, very new poem by Phyllis Cole Dye. She's the editor of Poetry of Presence, one of my favorite anthologies, and it is in her new book. It came out this week called Staying Power by Phyllis Cole Dye. This is In Line at the Grocery Store. I miss the tenderness the man ahead of me whispers to his cart, or to the perilous air, perhaps even to me, standing 6 feet back in tears behind my mask. I miss the tenderness, the man ahead of me whispers. It's such a beautiful, simple naming. And I think so often what we name, the things that we miss, we name the actuality of them. I miss holding my granddaughter. I miss hugging my friends. But what this poem invites us to do is to dig inside of the action, dig inside of the experience, and see what is that abstract longing. What is that unmet need that's in us right now? So for instance, I miss hugging my friends could be, I miss intimacy. I miss feeling known. So I want to invite you to make a list of the things that you miss and notice not just what you miss, but what is the abstract longing inside of that. And then imagine, this is the imaginary part, we get to go off for a moment into your head and into the realm of make-believe. Imagine you are the person in the grocery store speaking your longing to the air, to the cart, to the person in front of you, and tell them what you miss. I miss intimacy. And imagine, what is their response? What is the response you wish they would have? It may be in your poem, they don't give it to you, or maybe they do. But play with that wish, play with that longing, and see how it resonates when you speak it to the world. There's a poem that was on Garrison Keillor's daily poetry blog the other day by Jonathan Green. It was called During the Plague. And in it, he wrote, "Thank God for moments of past life we treasure in the memory." And I think that so many of the losses that we experienced during this time were based on memories we'd had in the past, things that were amazing that we expected. We always thought they would go on and on. We thought we would have another chance to have a choir concert. We thought that we would have another chance to just sit down with our friend outside on Main Street and talk over coffee. So we thought we would get to go to our job and do our work. What I like about this next poem by Laura Grace Weldon is that it takes a memory and it brings it back in such deep fullness that it really pays homage to everything that we miss by noticing what isn't here, by noticing what used to be here. Laura Grace Weldon was the Ohio Poet of the Year in 2019, and she has an incredible new book out called Portal, which won the Halcyon Prize just this year. It came out last week. This poem is No Family Sundays since March 16th, 2020. The day's oars dip and lift, time sliding past, silver as droplets fancied up by sunlight. A girl in dinosaur pattern boots explores creek rivulets, shakes cattail fluff into chill skies, saying, "Go, grow." A boy prods the pond's ice with a stick, tosses to see it skitter over the surface, mourns it can't be retrieved. Inside, a toddler carries blocks in her fist, leaves them behind the pillow, under chair, behind the trunk. Voices around the breakfast table, at the fireplace, in the garage and basement. Dogs tussle, then sleep. Breakfast dishes washed. Table laden anew with lunch. All of us so accustomed to Sundays together. We don't imagine it might be our last in however. What silver drops of now might we savor more slowly? What old wooden block found behind the trunk might we cradle in our hands? What I love so much about this poem is how Laura brings in all of the senses. She brings in all of the characters. She brings in that whole scene of what it was that she loved so much. Something simple, something daily, something ritualistic, habitual, that was lost. And how taken for granted that moment had been before, and how deep the loss is now that we don't have it. So I invite you to do that, to take a memory of something pre-COVID, something that you took for granted, and write it back into existence. All of the things that made it so rich, all the details, include as many senses as you can, what it tasted like, what it smelled like, what it felt like. Bring that moment back and honor it. Honor the lack of it by honoring the realness of it in the past. But then you may want to also do what she suggests in the last 2 lines of the poem. She asks us, what silver drops of now might we savor more slowly? Knowing that even now there is something beautiful happening, something that when things return to some other state, which they always will be changing, what about now will we miss? What is the silver drop that sometime in the future we'll think, oh my goodness, I thought I'd always have that. I really like that about this poem, that it, as much as it recognizes the lack of this moment, it also honors there's something full about it too, something we might miss. Just as the thing about COVID is that it's huge, right? It's touched every aspect of our lives in almost every way, every little thing, our health, our careers, our families, our social circles, everything has been touched. And it can be overwhelming that way. And I think one thing that I like about this next poem is that it personifies COVID and makes it a little bit more real, touchable, understandable, meetable. This is by Joyce Sutphin, who was poet laureate of, or is still the poet laureate of Minnesota. And this poem was in the Writer's Almanac a few weeks ago. And this poem is called Another Name. I wrote it over and over. The way a junior high girl writes the name of a crush in her notebook, using a different style each time. First, slanting it to the right, the way I learned from the nuns. Then leaning it left to annoy them. Then in block letters, all caps. Then in the most perfect cursive, COVID-19, 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 coronavirus, COVID-19, COVID-19. Next day, or sometimes even the next hour, I'd forgotten. That's how much I hated it. That's how much I wanted it to disappear. Besides, I thought, history will give it another name, but no one will remember mine. That was by Joyce Sutphin, Minnesota's poet laureate. And I really do love the way that she just made COVID-19 something that she could reduce into handwriting, reduce it to a name. And by naming it, bringing it down, 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 down. I was kind of struck then by this idea. How else could we name it? How else could we name it? And wouldn't it be interesting to give coronavirus another name or many other names, and to maybe even write a poem that does this, in which we rename it, and you could talk about why you rename it this, or maybe you give it many, many, many different names, make another list poem out of it. For instance, instead of coronavirus, we could call it the dream usurper. We could call it the Zoom bringer. We could call it, there are so many different, you know, the loneliness maker. There's so many ways that we might frame it instead. And it would be interesting to see if you just continue to rename COVID over and over and over. There's so much power in naming things. So if you took the power to rename this chapter, what would you rename it? Make a list of those other names. And then I thought it might be interesting too, by the way, to rename yourself. kind of like how in the Bible, Saul underwent a transformation and became Paul. How has this time transformed you? And if you had a new name for yourself now, as someone who has moved through this time, what would you rename yourself? I also thought, and it was kind of suggested perhaps in the title of this webinar, Dear 2020, that one of the simplest ways to meet this last year is to write it a letter. Dear 2020. And see what shows up, and know that anything you write is the right thing to write, that every single feeling, every emotion, every experience that you want to share is the right thing to share. Here's another poem from Phyllis Koldai's new book, Staying Power. Again, she lives in South Dakota and is the editor of Poetry of Presence. And there's such a fascinating idea that comes at the end of this poem. This is hiking the loop. Head the other way for once. Backward to your usual forward, south instead of north. The trail won't mind if you do. Let the sun peer over your other shoulder. Let the mirror of the lake reflect your shadow side. The water will still hug the shore. Go around the burial ground only half a mile in instead of hours later. The dead will still keep company with the sod. Enter the open stretch of prairie from the west instead of the east. Its tall grasses will still bow their heads, worshiping the breeze. Rise up into the woods instead of sloping down. The trees will still welcome you. The hawks will still watch. The blue jays still squawk. The squirrels still scatter. Somewhere out in the middle of the loop, you are apt to meet your old self, striding down the narrow path. Smile to greet her. Step aside to let her pass. The reason I included this poem is because I thought, wouldn't it be incredible to meet our pre-COVID self somewhere in some part of our daily journey, right? You walk into the breakfast kitchen and you see your old self there sitting down at the table for breakfast. What would you tell that old version of yourself about what's about to come? Would you offer that earlier version of yourself advice? What would you tell that person about what are the specific details you might choose to tell? Would your old self believe you? How would your old self react? And would you choose to tell them after considering all the things you might? Would you tell them, or would you do what Phyllis Koldai does and just smile at them and step aside and let them be on their way? I think that'd be a really fun poem to write. That random meeting with that old version of yourself. And what did they not know? Or maybe what did they know that you don't? What do you know that they don't? And what kind of conversation might the two of you have? Just as that poem looks into the past, I love this poem because it looks into the future. And this is by January Gill O'Neill. She is the author of Rewilding and lives in Massachusetts with her children. And this poem was also in James Crusoe's new anthology, How to Love the World, but it came originally from her book, Misery Islands. And in this poem, Jan is looking forward. And of course, she wrote this poem, I think, in 2014 or earlier. So she wasn't talking about the pandemic, but I can imagine that for any moment where we're not really, things feel off, this is a poem that imagines the future and she writes it into being. In the company of women. Make me laugh over coffee. Make it a double, make it frothy, so it seethes in our delight. Make my cup overflow with your small happiness. I want to hoot and snort and cackle and chuckle. Let your laughter fill me like a bell. Let me listen to your ringing and singing as Billie Holiday croons above our heads. Sorry, the blues are nowhere to be found. Not tonight, not here. No makeup, no tears, only contours, only curves. Each sip takes back a pound. Each dry roasted swirl takes our soul. Can I have a refill? Just one more? Let the bitterness sink to the bottom of our lives. Let us take this joy to go. It's a great poem. Just as we had that other poem, by Laura Grace Weldon that imagined the beauty of the past, this poem imagines the glory of a future and writes it into it. It allows us to imagine what can be. What is the potential? So that we can move toward that potential, knowing we can't actually create it into being, but to vision it is to allow its possibility. I bet Jan laughed while she wrote this poem. I bet it brought some joy. And imagine, this is your prompt. Imagine a future moment that you want to live into and write it. So much depends on how we frame things. That was one of the original ideas that we started with at the beginning of this. When I first started talking, how we tell a story matters. How we frame a story matters. And I love this next poem by James Cruz, who lives in Vermont and is an incredible poet. His newest book is Bluebird, is his own book of poems, and then How to Love the World. His other anthology is Healing the Divide. And in this poem, I love how he goes into the outside world and allows it to help him reframe what's been happening. This is Consider the Lilies. This is the unbreaking news. Today on my walk, I saw hundreds of trout lilies breaking through leaf litter, their spotted green leaves nearly translucent in the sun, pointed upward like spears, already turning the leftovers of this last difficult year into fertilizer, into food. Consider these lilies, how they would never call themselves broken simply because they had to live in darkness and cold for months. How they don't have to be told to reach for the dappled light they know they need to bloom. Wow, he really changes it, doesn't it? They'd never call themselves broken simply because they had to live in darkness and cold for months. I mean, what if we did that kind of a reframe for ourselves? What if we understood, because honestly, it is natural. A pandemic is actually a natural event. And what if we let it be something that helped nourish us in certain ways? What if you went outside, it's spring, look around for a symbol of resilience? What else has survived a dark, cold, solitary time? How has that time been necessary for that, whatever it is you let your eyes land on? And you could just follow this beautiful little prompt that I've actually used many, many times over the years for myself. Consider the, and fill in the blank. Consider the evergreens. Consider the lilies. Consider the millipede. Consider the garlic. And notice, as James said, I love this line so much. How do we turn the leftovers of last difficult year into food? How do we do that? Part of how we do that is how we choose to tell our story. What poem will we write? A poem, by the way, that doesn't ever pretend it was all okay. The only way we get here is by writing the truest, most authentic poems, by writing the truest, most authentic questions that we have. It will never, ever, ever work to just say it wasn't so bad. If it was, that will never work. The only poem worth writing is the one in which you tell the truth and in which you let the truth move through you, even perhaps the truth you least want to tell. Oh, I love this next poem by Mary Zibist, and I'm not totally sure that's how to say her name. But in this poem, she meets a huge grief of the year, the death of her father. And she takes a step forward. How do we move through this time? This is at the vaccination, which was in the Washington Post a week or two ago. When the needle went into my arm, I swear the light went cool. The shadows of the orange cones mazing the parking lot deepened, and the ghosts in my throat rushed closer to my blown down heart. I was not going to die like my father, said the needle, stitching me to my life. I kept replaying it, the virus in him, my mind like the screen on which I watched its cruel slowness. In my rear view, a line of cars longer than I could see. Here I am, I thought, becoming someone seeable again, someone safe for someone else to see again. I lifted my face toward the sun, closed my eyes until I could see the wavelets behind my eyelids, began to move again. I don't know how to multiply that prayer. You know, this poem meets that grief by taking a solid step forward. And I thought, if you were vaccinated, write a poem about what the needle said to you. The needle says to Mary Zizabist, I don't know how to say her name, Mary, I'm so sorry. The needle says to her that she's not going to die like her father. She says that it stitches her to her own life. What did the needle say to you when you were vaccinated? And if you chose not to get vaccinated, what do you have to say to the needle? Write a poem in which you have a conversation with the vaccine. Whatever you have to write about it, the truest thing you have to write is exactly the right thing to say. Well, we have two more poems. I actually have more, but I'm going to cut it short because I wanted to keep it to less than 45 minutes. This is a very short one by Lucille Clifton, who was an Emmy Award-winning, Lannan Award-winning, 2 National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship-winning poet. She died back in 2010, but this is the lesson of the falling leaves. The leaves believe such letting go is love. Such love is faith. Such faith is grace. Such grace is God. I agree with the leaves. That was the lesson of the falling leaves. And I imagine to myself this. Imagine that each of us are a tree. Imagine that all of the losses of the last year are leaves. Knowing that they will only fall away when it's time. There is nothing we can do to make them fall away. But at some point, we do let go of that loss, of our identity created around that loss. At some point, we let that go. Not all of them will let go, and not all of them will let go at once. But imagine you're a tree and you could write yourself into that poem of being the tree and each leaf a loss. And notice, how does it feel when one of them falls away? How does it feel when it doesn't? No effort on your part, right? The tree can't try and lose those leaves. I'm going to close with this last poem. It's the one that I wrote last night. And The trick about COVID and its losses and blessings, of course, is that it's still ongoing. It's not like it's over. So many of the losses are still with us, and we continue to lose. And so many of the facts are still with us. I have a person in my life who I'm extremely close to, who is struggling severely right now by depression, in part brought on by the large constellation events of this time, of this period. And each of us is in our own way trying to hold all of these losses and all of these blessings at the same time. Man, it isn't easy. So this poem is how much wider. Tonight, the heart is a vase filled with thistles and lilies, burdock and roses, knapweed and voluptuous peonies. It is perhaps not the bouquet I would choose, but it is what is here. But it's hard to hold it all, I say to the world. And it is. It's too much, I say. But is it? And I'm scared the vase will break. But it doesn't. Instead, it widens to contain what is in it. Stems of puncture vine and poppies, leafy spurge and delicate leucanthus. And so I hold it. I hold it all. And the vase doesn't break, but all as it widens. The ache. Oh, friends, it just isn't easy, is it? But when we choose to meet it, we allow it to move through us. In fact, we aren't the vase then. When we choose to meet it, instead of needing to hold it and hold it and hold it and hold it, we let it move through us. That's what writing poems does for us, is it helps us to meet the moment. It helps us meet the moments that brought us into this moment. It helps us show up to be vital, to be alive, to be here, to be present. And it doesn't fix anything. It doesn't fix anything. I wish it did. Wouldn't that be great? But can you believe I got this far without crying? It doesn't fix anything, but writing poems does help us meet the whole self. It helps us give to the world. It helps us know who we are and what it is that it means to be alive. So, thank you. Thanks for the virtual hug. Oh, thanks for showing up, Carrie.
I didn't want you to cry alone, so I'm here.
Oh, that's so sweet. And thanks to SHYFT for making this all possible. This video will be available, so please do go ahead and watch it later. I will put as many links as I can to the poems so you can find them and read along with them, and go ahead and put this on pause and right away, meet the world, meet yourself in the world, to see what happens when you choose to show up and narrate your own story. Thanks, Carrie. Thanks to SHYFT for making this possible. Thanks to all of you for showing up. Thanks so much.
I'll send the video. It probably won't be till tomorrow morning, but I'll send it to everybody tomorrow morning. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I'm just reading the comments too. Thanks for all these lovely comments. I love the way Emily Style made vasing into a verb.
Great.
Thank you, friends.
Fun.